Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to lecture number 8 of Software Requirements Engineering, CSE305. And in today's lecture, we'll continue our discussion on requirements elicitation process. Just to give you guys a quick recap of what we did in our previous lecture, we continued again our discussion on elicitation process. We have been on it for past 3 lectures now, including today's lecture. And in the first lecture, we talked about what is an elicitation process and what are the different stages of this process and what are the possible activities that we might do in those different stages. But in the last lecture, we talked about we started talking about different elicitation techniques. But before we got to it, there was something very important, which is very integral to a good elicitation process, and that was stakeholder analysis. Now, if you guys remember, we have talked about this a lot, that identifying the people who are going to give you requirements is really important, and missing on somebody would mean that you miss on maybe very important services or constraints on the system because you didn't talk to that person who knew all those things. So stakeholder analysis is really important, and when we talk about stakeholder analysis, then it does not only include identifying people, so it also includes identifying their interest, their attitude, and how are you going to talk to different people, because when you identify that this guy has a certain kind of an attitude, he's really strict, and and his interests are he's more into technology, or he's not into technology, for example, then maybe you need to talk to that person in a totally different fashion. So when we say stakeholder analysis, then it's not only about identifying. So one aspect is to identify stakeholders. So that is one aspect of stakeholder analysis. But that's not the only thing that we do when we say stakeholder analysis. The other thing that we do is we try to identify the attitudes and interests of different stakeholders. Because why this is necessary? Because we want to know that how we will deal with different people, because that is very important. Because if we are not able to communicate to these people effectively, we will not be able to elicit requirements in a proper fashion. So then we said that who are the different stakeholders in a system, and we basically talked about that in terms of project management. Then usually the competitors, they are also considered to be stakeholders. But when we talk about requirements elicitation, then maybe you're not going to talk to the competitors. So it's a slightly restricted definition of stakeholders when we talk about elicitation process. And you say that anybody who would help you in completing your goal or objective of building that system, he or she is your stakeholder. And we said that it can include the users of the system, it can include, so who are stakeholders? We said it can include the users of the system, it can include the sponsor, it can include the developers who are working on theme, and all the software engineers who are working on it. It can also include the suppliers, it can include all the contractors. So anybody who has anything to do with the system, who will benefit you in some fashion, or who will be affected by this software being installed in your place, he or she is your stakeholder. So that was our discussion on stakeholder analysis, and we discussed why it's important to identify people or the people who are responsible for giving you requirements properly. Next, we moved to elicitation techniques. Because one of the things that we are going to do when we discuss each of these sub processes of requirements engineering process is that we are going to talk about that how do we conduct a process. And we said that there are different techniques that can be used to elicit requirements, and one of them we discussed was interviews. And we discussed before we moving on to the specifics, we said there are some do's and don'ts that you should not do in an interview. For example, you should not be arguing among each other. For example, there are 2 of you who have two requirement analysts go and meet a client. Then if they start arguing among themselves, then it's not a really good idea, because it will not give a good impression on the client that you are not on the same page. And similarly, you should not ask Similarly, in an interview, you should not interrupt the client, because that's not a good idea. Let him finish first, and then give your point of view if you feel that is that will add to whatever you are asking the client. And similarly, then we talked about different guides, that how we create an effective questionnaire, and there are certain things that we need to keep in our mind when we are creating questionnaire. For example, the background of the interviewee whom we are going to give this questionnaire, for whom we are preparing these questions, that is really important. So the kind of words that we use, we need to be very careful. We need to think about that whether the questions I should have in an interview, they should be open-ended or close-ended questions. Similarly, we should avoid double-barrel questions, so there should not be question and another question, which this would make the whole discussion very confusing. So we talked about that how we can create effective questionnaires, and then towards the end of the lecture, we just looked at a context-free interview. And the reason why we say it's context-free, because it was really generic, and we did not actually impose, we did not actually had any perception of the interview or the questions in the interview. It didn't give any impression that we are asking questions for this particular context. So they were really kind of sort of generic, and it gives the interviewee it gives the client an option to express himself more freely, because when you ask these kind of questions, and there would be times then you find a person or a client whom you're asking these questions, he is very friendly and he wants to tell you a lot, so he will be expressing and he will be answering those questions in a lot more detail than the other guy. So it depends how effective you are in asking these questions, and how effective you are in your communication to actually extract whatever you wanted to. So that is what we discussed in our previous lecture. We'll continue our discussion again, as I said. In today's lecture, we'll continue our discussion on elicitation process, and specifically we'll talk about different and more elicitation techniques. We'll discuss what are scenarios and how they are used to elicit requirements. Similarly, another requirements elicitation technique is observation and social analysis. So we are going to talk about it, that how by observing people, and how by looking at how they socially interact with their colleagues, and how do they conduct their current processes, how it helps our requirement analyst in understanding the system. And towards the end, we will also talk about another elicitation technique, which is prototyping. And most of you would be familiar with one of the software development lifecycle process model, which is prototyping. And this is actually more or less would be the same, where we talk about that how prototypes are used to effectively, how they are used to elicit requirements from the clients. So let's start our discussion with scenarios. So what are scenarios? If you look at this word scenario, then we can say that a scenario is a small story, or is a small interaction where some people who are within that system, they are doing something. So formally, I think, or more properly, I think it's defined as scenarios are stories which explain how a system might be used. They should include. So what should a scenario include? A description of the system state before entering the scenario, the normal flow of events in the scenario, exceptions to the normal flow of events, and information about concurrent activities, a description of the system state at the end of the scenario. So there are two things which a scenario would always have. That what was the state of the system before you entered the scenario. So let's imagine that you have a pre-state. Let's call it the initial state of the system. So before, let's say this is my whole scenario. And so before entering the scenario, I have an initial state. So a scenario would always have an initial state, which would tell once I record the scenario, then as a requirement analyst, I would know that before entering the scenario, my system should be in this state, and after the scenario, the state of the system would be different. So again, I will have the information about state of the system when the scenario ends. So here the scenario is starting, and here the scenario is ending. And what would be happening within the scenario? So there would be some events. So for example, this scenario starts here, and there are different things happening, and these are all events, which on the basis of these events, different things are happening. So for example, if that's the event, these things are happening, and then we get out of here. So basically, the third thing that would be there are these events. These events through which this scenario is actually is happening. and then there are some normal flow events, which is the normal execution of this scenario. But there might be some exceptions. For example, let's say that there was an exception here. This is the normal flow. So let's say this double line, it shows the normal flow, and this single line, this is an exception. So another thing that might be in a scenario is exception. And then there might be some information about concurrent activities. For example, this is the normal flow. So let's say there is another activity which is happening here, and this is normal flow, and these two activities, they are concurrent activities. So another thing that might be there is, so these activities, they are concurrent activities. So a scenario would have 5 things. It would have initial state of the system, it will have the ending state of the system once the scenario ends, then it would have information about normal flow of events, and then it would have information about any exceptions in that normal flow. It would also have information about any concurrent activities which are happening in that particular scenario. So scenarios, they are examples of interaction sessions. They describe how a user interacts with the system. For example, consider an example of learning management system. Now if I am a student, one possible scenario in which I will use that LMS is that I log in and I look at the list of my courses, and if there is any update in one of the courses, then I would go and click that update, I will view that, and then I log out. So that is one scenario. Another scenario might be I just log in and I log out. That is another scenario. I log in and I submit an assignment, then I log out. That is another scenario. So all these things, they are scenarios because there are normal events happening, and then so these are scenarios. So how does these scenario, why we want to look at these scenarios and how they are useful? Discovering scenarios exposes possible system interactions and reveals system facilities which may be required. Because once we develop our understanding that how different users are going to interact with the system and what are different events that would change the state of the system, it gives us an understanding, that how our solution should behave. So scenarios are really interesting, and it's one of it's a very convenient way of recording or eliciting requirements. They are very helpful. So for example, let's consider our library example which we did yesterday, and document ordering. For example, you want to order a certain document, a paper or something. So what you do is you log on to this library cataloging system, you issue order document command, enter reference number of the required document, select a delivery option, log out from that system, and this sequence of events can also be illustrated in a diagram. So this whole scenario can be shown in a diagram, and this is the diagram that you submit a user ID and password to the system. And what's happening here is that, so for example, this is the information that you are entering into the system. So you use it to log in, and this is the operational terminal. Now this is an exception. So the normal flow is that you enter your login and password. If your login is okay, then you come here, you select an order and document, and if your order is accepted, you input the document reference number. If document reference number is okay, you confirm delivery details. If delivery is confirmed, you log out from the system. So these things, all these events and all these things, all these activities which are taking place, they represent the normal flow. So this is the normal flow of this particular scenario, but there are exceptions at all those states. So for example, when you submit your user ID and password, then your user ID may be wrong, your password may be wrong, and an exception might be generated, that invalid ID or password, and then you're thrown back again at the starting state of this scenario where you have to re-enter your username and password. So this is one exception. Another exception is that you select to order a certain document, but the permission is denied. Okay, so when the permission is denied, then you ask that why the permission is denied. So there can be an option that, okay, we need to have some help available for the user, that whenever something goes wrong, then he should be able to identify that what's the problem or why this exception has been generated. And the next task was input document reference, and there can be that you entered an incorrect reference. For example, you wanted to enter the paper name or the journal title and things like that, but you entered something wrong, and then an exception was generated. And similarly, you were trying to log out, but you already logged out because you were not active in the session for a certain while, because this is one of the features that is implemented, that if you're not active on a website for a certain while, then you are logged out. It is done for security purposes and all those things. So anyways, these activities which are down here, they show the exceptions for this particular scenario. Now, if you are a requirement analyst, and instead of conducting an interview, what you do, you try to look at the traditional. For example, you're making this library cataloging system, and you wanted to, and you go and observe another facility at another library where they have automated it, and you try to observe that what do the users do when they are trying to order a new document, and you observe them and you try to create that scenario, that okay, try to ask people, okay, how should this be done, and they tell you, okay, we should have user ID and password, or we enter user ID password in our system, but if that is wrong, then an exception is generated. So maybe this is how we are actually identifying requirements, that we would have certain login requirements, that we need to have a proper user ID and password, only then login would take place. But there would be another requirement that, okay, if the user ID or password is incorrect, then an error should be indicated, which should tell the client that, okay, you are entering your information incorrectly. And then following this scenario, okay, what would you do after that? Because remember, we are trying to order a document. So kindly tell us, what you are going to do after you enter your. What do you do? So then they would say, okay, we select a particular document which we want to. Which we want to basically order, and okay, if that is the normal scenario, then you would enter the document details and so on and so forth. So by doing so, we are actually eliciting requirements. But this is a very interesting and very efficient way of eliciting requirements. But because normally conducting an interview, it's not an easy task, and not everybody can do those interviews. I'm not saying that everybody can create these scenarios, but normally they are easier to make in comparison to conducting an interview and eliciting requirements from them, because they give you an automated way of identifying, okay, these are the 10 requirements that I've got from this particular scenario. So normally scenarios are very helpful. And one of the examples that you guys are familiar with, which are a particular kind of scenario, are use cases. So we are all familiar with the use cases. Use cases is a certain type of a scenario. We are going to talk about it in our coming slides. So let's talk about scenarios and object-oriented design in particular. So scenarios, what are scenarios? Scenarios are an inherent part of some object-oriented development methods. The term use case, as I just said, that is a specific case of system usage, is sometimes used to refer to a scenario. Okay. Because if you guys remember, then each use case is a scenario in the system. Okay, there are different views on the relationships between use cases and scenarios. A use case is a scenario, that is one view. That a use case is a scenario. A scenario is a collection of use cases. So another view is that a scenario is a collection of use cases. Therefore, each exceptional interface is represented as a separate use case. So for example, if you create separate use cases, for example, you want to create one use case for login. Okay, now that is a complete scenario on its own. So we can say that, okay, a scenario is a collection of use cases. But if you're referring to that use case is a scenario, that each use case is a scenario, then these are just different views on. But just remember that use cases are a special kind of, they show how a user would interact with the system, and hence they actually show they are a representation of scenarios. Let's think about our LMS example, and let's say this is the student, and this is my system boundary, and I want to identify that how a student will use my LMS system. So for example, one thing that he would do, he would log in, and the other thing he would do, he would view courses. Another thing he might do is submit assignments. Another thing that he or she might do is view grades. Another thing that this user might do is talk to. Okay, let's forget that. So basically, let's say if these are the four things, then a student logging in and viewing these and these. So all of these things are, this is one scenario, this is another scenario, and so in this particular case, each one of these use cases, login, view course, submit assignment, view grades, each one of these use cases is a scenario. because when I log in, there would be some normal flow of events, there would be some exceptions. Whenever I try to view my courses, there is normal flow of events and there might be some exceptions, and my state of the system might change. And similarly, when I submit an assignment, then there would be a pre-state of the initial state of the system and the scenario. So a very interesting way of looking that that whether a use case represents a scenario or not is, that whenever a scenario executes, then we know there are 5 things in a scenario. There is an initial state of the system, there is the final state of the system when the scenario ends, and there are normal flow of events, then there are some exceptions, and if there are any concurrent things happening, any concurrent activities, then they are also represented in a scenario. So use cases which we are very, very familiar with, they are an example of scenarios. Okay, so the next elicitation technique which we are going to discuss today is observation and social analysis. So why this is important? Because as I told you earlier, one of the things that we discussed, or one of the elicitation problems that we discussed in our previous lectures, was that normally people who are really, really capable, they're really busy in an organization, and it's very difficult for you to interview them. It's very difficult for you to ask them to help you make this overall scenario. So how you are going to actually see how they are doing their business, and how you are going to see that how do they tackle problems. So the one way of doing all this is observing them. So you just sit with them, or you just follow them, or you sit in a separate room where you're just viewing how they are going about their business. But that is a very effective way of eliciting requirements, that you observe people. Okay. So and another problem was that people at times people are not very comfortable in actually explaining how they do their work. But so observing them would be a solution to that, because somebody is not very good at expressing himself or herself. Then it's a good idea to actually sit with them and observe them. Okay, that okay, that's how they do it. So this is a very interesting way of eliciting requirements. So let's see what in more detail what observation and social analysis is about. So people often find it hard to describe what they do because it is so natural to them. Okay? And when I say it, so if I am really good at, for example, debugging code, then even if you ask me and I want to tell you that how I debug it, but at least I will not be able to explain it completely, that how I go about finding the problem. Okay, because I am good at it, and I just find that okay, that is the problem. But if I have to express it to you, then it not be that easy. So and similarly, so basically at times people cannot actually explain properly, even though they want to, they want to cooperate, but they are not able to explain it. So observation is one of the things that can be done. So ethnography is a technique. So for example, ethnography, which is one of the techniques from social sciences, can be used. Actual work processes often differ from formal prescribed processes. An ethnographer spends some time observing people at work and building up a picture of how work is done. So this is very interesting discussion, because and this is sort of related to modeling the current processes of an organization. And why I find it interesting, because one of the things I do is process improvement, and that is very close to it. So what happens is that there are 2 kinds of processes which exist. One kind of process, we call them descriptive processes, and the other processes are called prescriptive processes. Or we can call them that another name of this is a more sort of informal name of this is to be process, and an informal name for this is as is process. Okay, so and that's why I keep on saying that some processes, that every process is considered to be, you cannot actually use a process as it is prescribed. So for example, you figure out, okay, this is a wonderful process, and let's adapt that in our organization. So you need to actually adapt it. You cannot copy it as it is, because that was built for a different context maybe. And that is maybe more generic. So you need to actually pick up the things which suit your organization. So normally that's why it said that the things which are prescribed, they are usually more formal. okay, and they're more generic. So you need to tailor them according to your context. So why this observation and social analysis is interesting is because when an ethnographer is actually observing people at work, then what he's trying to do, he's not asking them any questions, he's just letting them go about their business, and he's just nobody there, and he's just looking at people work, and and just he's making a mental model, and he later on what he does is he tries to make a picture, or he tries to model what are the current practices, or what are the as-is processes, how people are operating right now. And this modeling is very essential in order to achieve that. If you want to prescribe anything, then before you do it, it's very important to understand how things are done correctly. And that's why this aspect is really important and really interesting to model the current processes. And I will not go into too much detail on how these processes are modeled and what are different aspects that we need to model in a process. But this is a very brief introduction about how the process improvement, or what are the basics of process improvement. That these are basics of change. That if you want to, because whenever new software is being built for an organization, then that would mean that their processes are going to change. And whenever the processes are going to change, then we need to understand the current processes. And one of the ways that these current processes can be understood is by observing people. And that is a very ideal, that is a very effective way of modeling the how people currently deal with the business. So what are the guidelines for ethnography? Number one is that you assume that people are good at doing their job and look for non-standard ways of looking. Okay, spend time getting to know the people and establish a trust relationship. Okay, so if you are sitting with the people who are actually working, so they can actually see you, whether you're right there. So if they don't trust you, they might not be comfortable, and then they might not be as effective, or they might not do things their way, because you are observing them, so they might try to behave in a totally different fashion. So you need to build a relationship with them. Keep detailed notes of all the work practices, analyze them, and draw conclusions from them. So you need to really record everything, that how they are doing. Once a new change request comes in, okay, how does the resource who actually got that change request, how does he deal with it? Whether he reports it to the project manager, or he gives it to team lead, or what does he do, or he just starts implementing it. So you need to keep detailed record of everything, and how the change analysis is conducted, who actually decides whether this change needs to be implemented or not. So you need to record all these kind of things. And or for example, if it's tester, you're observing one of the guys who is responsible for testing the software, how the bugs are reported, because let's assume that this was done manually, then how they're recorded, and how they're communicated to the developer, and how does the developer respond back to the tester. So you need to keep a very detailed record of everything when you're analyzing people. Combine observation and open-ended interviewing. So that's a very interesting thing, that once you have a trust relationship with one of the stakeholders, and he's working and you're sitting with him, and he's kind of busy in doing his stuff, but you can ask some questions. That how would you have done if that would have happened, and these kind of questions, which are kind of open-ended, but it would give you more insight into the process. So that's always a good idea if you can do it. It might not be possible always. So organize a regular debriefing session where the ethnographer talks with the people outside the process. So it is very important that whatever notes or whatever analysis you are conducting, you actually talk with the people who are not part of this process. And combine ethnography with other elicitation techniques, as it's been said already, that you can combine interviewing with ethnography, you can combine scenarios with ethnography, because one very effective way is that you are doing ethnography and you are doing those scenarios, you are making a use case alongside, and you are doing these kind of things. So it's always a good idea to combine these two different techniques, because it would mean that you are eliciting requirements, you're doing it more effectively. It will increase the effectiveness of the elicitation process. So ethnography and elicitation, how if we try to model it, then how it would look like, how the elicitation process would look like if my technique is ethnography. Then what you do is that you do this ethnography analysis. So when we said ethnographic analysis, though, basically what I'm doing is that this is I observed people, I talked to people, and I basically took lots of notes, and on the basis of that I have done my analysis. So ethnographer has done his analysis, and then what should follow this is a debriefing meeting. where you basically talk to the people who are not part of this process, as I already said, and you debrief them. Okay, this is what we have got, that how these people are currently conducting their business. Okay, and based on that, you basically do a system prototype. We are going to talk about, you know, what is prototyping, but based on that, you do some prototyping, and then you might do, based on that prototype, you might do some focused ethnography to actually improve your prototype. So that is the goal here. And again, your system prototype is also an input, possible input here, and then your user experiment, they're also an input to the system prototype. So ethnography is really essential, because that is one possible way that ethnography can be included in the overall elicitation process. But these two activities, they are always going to happen, ethnography analysis and debriefing meeting. What can happen here is that you start eliciting requirements. After that, you have a set of of requirements, and you do that analysis check and feasibility check that we talked about in our first lecture on the elicitation process, and you filter some requirements that you're going to specify later on. So this is how it can be done, and this is an example that how ethnography can be combined with prototyping, which is another requirements elicitation technique. So what are different ethnographic perspectives? So the work setting viewpoint, there are different viewpoints. The work setting viewpoint, social and organizational perspective, then we have the workflow viewpoint. So what is the work setting viewpoint? This describes the context and the physical location of the work and how people use objects to carry out tasks. So we want to understand that in the work environment that people have, how they are using different objects and how they are carrying out their tasks physically in that space. Therefore, in a study of a help desk, for example, this would describe the objects which the helper had to hand and how these were organized. Then the next is the social and organizational perspectives. So this tries to bring out the day-to-day experience of the work as seen by different people who are involved. Each individual typically sees the work in a different way, and this viewpoint tries to organize and integrate all of these perceptions. Then the final one is the workflow viewpoint, and this viewpoint presents the work from a series of work activities with information flowing from one activity to another. Now you can imagine that when you are doing this ethnographic analysis, then you are maybe combining these different viewpoints. You also have the work setting viewpoint, you also have the social and organizational perspective, and you also have the workflow viewpoint. But all three of them, they give you a different angle of observing people. When you are when you are going through that work setting perspective, then you are actually looking at the physical objects, or in the work environment how they are dealing with different things. And in the social and organizational perspective, you are seeing different people, not just one person. You are seeing at different people that how the people who are usually involved in things, how do they handle it. And then from the workflow viewpoint, you are seeing that what was this activity and how it is connected to the other. For example, you are observing one person, and the things that he is doing, they are being carried out by another person later on. So you want to also identify that, okay, how this activity is going to affect the other activity. So different perspectives give you more detailed insight into the current processes of any organization. Okay, so another requirements elicitation technique is requirements reuse, and as it is very clear, I think that you have written some set of requirements for an initial software, so you can adapt them, and you can for a new similar software that you are going to make. For example, you have already deployed a LMS for a university, and you got another similar project, and before you actually go and talk to those guys, you already have set of requirements because you have already built this product and you have done this project for multiple clients. So you can have those set of requirements, you can take them along and they would help you in eliciting requirements in a better fashion. So what does reuse involve? It involves taking the requirements which have been developed for one system and using them in a different system. And why they are useful? Because it saves time and effort, as reuse requirements have already been analyzed and validated in other systems. That is the beauty of it, because you have set of specifications which you have already validated for one system. You have already built a system based on those requirements which is working somewhere else. So whenever you reuse those requirements, it's a guarantee that, okay, these things, they do work, and they were validated by one client. So you need to just tailor them maybe according to the needs of the new organization, according to the needs of a new university, if you're talking about the learning management system. So currently, requirement reuse is an informal process, but more systematic reuse could lead to larger cost savings. It's correct that normally this is informal, and if you tell somebody, okay, we are not doing your proper requirement analysis because we already have a set of requirements, then it might annoy them. Okay. So that is not something that you're going to share to a client, for example, but this is something for your use, that if you have that, then you can actually use it, because it ensures that you're in a good position to conduct the elicitation in a very good fashion, because you already have set of requirements and you know what are the things that you're going to talk about from this particular client. So the reuse, it's going to save your effort, it is going to save you time, and because these requirements are already validated, so you just need to ask the client, okay, I think that this can be done so you just take their opinion, and because you already have set of requirements, so you would just tailor them according to the needs of that particular client, and you are going to take it back to them, okay, this is the final set of requirements. So as I've said, that normally it's very informal, but if it becomes more systematic, then it can have huge impact on cost savings, and it might ensure that the problems people have with requirements, it's going to solve them in a big way. So what are the reuse possibilities? Where the requirement is concerned with providing application domain information. So for example, you're making a website, and then you've made, for example, the learning management system. Now that's a very good example, because my application domain is a university, and I've developed already a system for that, and I do it for another client, then my domain is same. And I do not need to go and understand the application domain because this is the same, it's another university. They might do registration in a different fashion, they might submit results, they might register courses in a different fashion, but it's a university, so I'm not changing my application domain. So that's one possibility where requirements can be reused. And where the requirements is concerned with the style of information presentation, reuse leads to consistency of style across applications. So those requirements can be reused, and where the requirements reflects company policies such as security policies. For example, I am the client and I want you to make a software for me, and but I have some securities which are some standards which I need to ensure that whatever you make for me, you put those security checks in it, and you incorporate those security policies in whatever you're going to deliver to me. So I would hand you those list of things, and I would tell you, okay, these are the things that I want in my new system. So basically that's another possibility where requirements can be reused. So requirements reuse is something which can be thought of as an elicitation technique, or you can think of them as, because they are going to facilitate this elicitation process. So next up is prototyping, and if you guys remember your course on software engineering, you would have gone through different software development lifecycle models, where you talked about those generic lifecycle models such as waterfall, incremental. One of the things that we discuss when we are discussing this prototyping model is that it can be used to elicit requirements from the client. And if you guys remember, one of the examples, or one of the scenarios I told you in my previous lecture is that that couple of my students, they said, okay, they were doing a semester project, but they were very enthusiastic, and they said, okay, we want to do a project for a client. And they went to a client from one of their, it was a reference, and they went to a client and they started talking to him, and they started asking they started eliciting requirements, and they started interviewing the client. But the client was, as one of the problems with elicitation is that the client, he might not have any, he might not be a technical person, and he was not computer literate. So asking him question that what are the features that you want in the system, and these kind of things, it was not helpful. And in fact, in the end, the client said that show me something, show me what you can do for me, and then I will tell you that, okay, these are the things that I want, and these are the things that I do not want. So prototyping is a very effective way of eliciting requirements, because you perceive the system based on some initial discussions, and depending on that perception, you basically skip everything. So for example, one of the things with prototyping is that you do some sort of analysis, you gather some sort of requirements at the beginning, and you skip all these designing bit, and you basically skip this whole part, and you straight away go to implementation. You implement something, and that implementation is basically your prototype. And because you do not want to spend too much time on it, because you are using it to understand or elicit requirements from the client. So you do not waste time on designing. You just, based on your perception or your initial elicitation, you develop something and you show it to the client. Okay, and then by looking at that, the client would say, okay, no, these are the things I want, no, but this is in the right direction. So then you finalize things. Okay, and that's why one of the things which is always said whenever you use a prototyping model is that this initial prototype, when it is made, normally it is called a throwaway prototype. So why we call it, why there is a need to throw it away, because we did not did any deliberation about designing this prototype. So we were not careful about choosing the architecture of the product. We were not careful about what kind of data structures should be used. And so normally people suggest that whenever you make a prototype, because we do not spend too much time in thinking about what would be the effective design for this particular prototype, so we normally throw it away and we start from scratch. But prototyping would have served its purpose by then, because it was meant to elicit or elicit requirements, and it served that purpose. Then you basically have some set of requirements, so start designing and then implementing and so on and so forth. So prototypes are valuable for requirement elicitation because user can experiment with the system and point out its strengths and weaknesses. So you have made a prototype, you give it to the client, okay, that play with it and let us know that what are the things that you like and which things you want us to improve further and which are the things you want us to get rid of. So they have something concrete to criticize. Nothing is in the air that you are just mentioning your ideas and based on those ideas they're saying, okay, this is a good idea. But when you have a prototype, they have something physical in front of them. They can actually use it and give you suggestions. So rapid development of prototypes is essential so that they are available early in the elicitation process. So that's why I said that we don't do designing. Based on our understanding or based on our initial elicitation, we develop a prototype, take it back to the client. Okay, so this is very rapid prototype development. So now some of the benefits are listed here of prototyping. Prototype allow users to experiment, as already been discussed, and discover what they really need to support their work. Establishes feasibility and usefulness before high development costs are incurred, and essential for developing the look and feel of your user interface. This second point is very interesting, that there are few things. Normally what is suggested is, in terms of, I think, agile development, this is suggested that you do quick prototyping of certain features where something new is suggested which you have not done before. You just want to check whether this is feasible for you to do or not, and what you do is you do a very quick prototype and you do it just to gauge that whether this can be done in the budget that is being suggested for it, or in the time that is suggested for this particular increment, because you want to have a very clear picture before you jump in into something. So prototyping is also very useful for that. You want to check the feasibility of a certain new feature that you're going to develop into the system. And it also gives the user an idea of the user interface, that how the system would look or how the end product might look like. Can be used for system testing and the development of documentation as well. It forces a detailed study of requirements which reveals inconsistencies and omissions. So prototyping is normally a very good idea. And as I said, it deals with lots of those elicitation problems that we have been discussing in our past lectures, that, for example, people are not very comfortable with, or they're not technical, they do not know how to express themselves, and they are not very friendly, they don't have a lot of time to talk to you. So if you have a prototype and if you give it to them and say, okay, in your own time, just give us suggestions about it, that would be a very good idea, because it saves their time, it saves your time, and it serves, more importantly, it serves your purpose, and it serves your purpose as a requirement analyst, that you had a prototype and you were able to elicit requirements in a proper fashion. So prototyping is one of, I think it's one of the most effective ways of eliciting requirements from a client. So normally, what are the different types of prototyping? One of them I have discussed with you is the throwaway prototyping. That is only intended to help and develop the system requirements. So when your goal is to understand and or elicit the system requirements, then you always kind of throw away the prototype, because that was the purpose of it. And if it served its purpose, then you just throw it away and start whatever software development lifecycle model you choose afterwards. You just use that and start working and developing a system and design the system, then develop the system. The requirements which should be prototyped are those which caused most difficulties to the customers and which are hardest to understand. So normally, for example, login is not something that I would want to create a prototype for, okay, because this is a very standard functionality where you have username and password and you encrypt them and all those things. So this is pretty standard from one system to another system, so you do not make a prototype for it, okay. A very interesting example is that you have a game, for example, a game similar to, let's say, a Temple Run, a free runner game, and you want to make it multiplayer, okay. And now this is something which you want to make a quick prototype, because you want to see that how, for example, I want to play a particular free runner game with one of my friends. And what I want to do is that I want to see that, okay, so I want to share my location with that person because he also want to see where I am. So this is very interesting, because a free runner, normal free runners, what they have is that you play them and it's just you, and with lots of hurdles that are coming your way. But when it becomes multiplayer, then it would be really interesting. So you can, for these kind of features which are very hard to understand and there might be some problems, you want to check feasibility, then you basically prototype them. So a throwaway prototype, it is used to elicit and develop the system requirements, and you normally prototype those things which are hard to understand for client and which are hard to understand for you as well, and you want to check the feasibility of those things. The second type is the evolutionary prototyping. They are intended to deliver a workable system quickly to the customer, and you can think of them as in terms of agile development, because normally the size of increments are really small in them, and you start with the core functionality of the system and you develop those things very quickly with minimal design and you deliver it to the client. And there are certain things that are done in agile methodologies. For example, there is something which is called refactoring, where you say that, okay, whatever you have written and you have deployed to the client, you actually keep on improving it with time. So that is an example of evolutionary prototyping where it is used. So therefore, the requirements which should be supported by the initial versions of this prototype are those which are well understood and which can deliver useful end user functionality. It is only after extensive use that poorly understood requirements should be implemented. So when you are using prototyping whenever you want to make prototype part of your system, then the first prototype that you are going to deliver to the client should have only those requirements which you have developed clear understanding of and which you are going to give some benefit to the end user as well. Because if you want to give a workable system to the user and you want him to start using it, then it should have some features which would actually increase his capacity to work. So there are two kinds. These are the main types of prototype. You have a throwaway prototype and then you have evolutionary prototyping. And throwaway prototype is done for those requirements which you do not understand, or which you do not have clear understanding of. Whereas in an evolutionary prototype, the prototypes are made for only those requirements which are very clear. So they are kind of two ends of the spectrum. Okay. So what are the prototyping costs and problems? Normally there is training costs. Prototype development may require the use of special purpose tools. For example, there are lots of mock-up tools available. If you just want to, if your client is just interested in looking at how my end product would look like and you want to make a quick prototype of it, then maybe you can use, there are lots of wireframing tools available which you can use online. You can make lots of those screenshots and you can connect them with clicks and all those things, and you can even, for example, if you're making a mobile phone, you can also deploy them on your phone, and they're very interesting. If the goal is that user just wants to see how my end product would look like, then there are development costs. Depend on the type of prototype being developed. Now let's imagine that you are developing a throwaway prototype. Then all the time that your developer spent on developing it, it's kind of, if you think in one way that it's wasted because you are throwing it away in the end. But it's not all wasted, because you used it to elicit requirements and develop clear understanding of the requirements, which is going to be helpful towards the timely and effective completion of the project. So extended development schedules. Developing a prototype may extend the schedule, although the prototyping time may be required because rework is avoided. As I said, that it has pros and it has cons. For example, we can say that we are wasting time, we are wasting resources because we are developing a prototype, but you can recover those things, because if because of it we are developing clear understanding of the requirement, then what it means is that the requirement changes that are part and parcel of every software development project, they would be reduced. And when there are lesser changes in the requirement, then it means there would be less rework, and hence the effort and time is saved. So you are actually recovering the time and the resources that you already spent on developing those prototypes. And incompleteness, it may not be possible to prototype critical system requirements. So at times it may not be possible to do also. So normally we say that we just do the feasibility checking, as I gave you the example of that multiplayer free runner. If you want to do it, you will not be in your prototype, you will not develop the complete system. You might just send some values from you just share the coordinates of where two people are on one cell phone, and you just I don't know, use a central server where you send your location and you get the location of the other guy and you share it among whoever is playing that free runner multiplayer game. So you will not be able to, you will not completely implement it, but you've checked the feasibility. So incompleteness is another problem with prototyping. So what are the different approaches which are used to prototyping? You can do paper prototyping. A paper mock-up of the system is developed and used for system experiments. This can be done. Then you have this wizard of Oz prototyping. A person simulates the response of the system in response to system user inputs. As I told you about those wireframing tools, where some of these tools, they kind of give us just a simulation that, okay, if a user presses this button, this is going to happen. If a user presses this button, this is going to happen. And then the final one is executable prototyping. So as the name suggests, it's a fourth generation language or other rapid development environment is used to develop an executable prototype, where user can actually execute and see some functionalities for which you have developed that prototype. So we have different types of prototyping, different approaches to prototyping. We have paper prototyping. We have this Wizard of Oz prototyping, where we say these simulations are done, and then we have this executable prototyping as well. So let's talk about what are these executable prototyping development. As I said, these are some fourth generation languages based around database systems, visual programming languages such as Visual Basic or and then दोबारा से करते हैं. So let's discuss now what is this executable prototype development. So as I said, these fourth generation languages based around database systems. Examples are, for example, Visual Basic or Object-Works. Internet-based prototyping solutions based on the World Wide Web browsers and languages such as Java. These are all the things which can be used to make these executable prototypes. Normally, the time and the cost that would be incurred in making or depend on what kind of approach is used. So you can safely say that depending on what type of approach you are using, you can sort of think that how, for example, if we have our time and cost here, and if we want to see if we have different approaches here, then if we have paper prototyping, then we might be here somewhere. So if we are doing this paper prototyping approach, if we have that other simulation based approach, then we might be here, and if we are creating something executable, then we might be here. But it might not be, this is just to indicate that when we have paper prototyping, then the cost would be lesser, because you're not asking your developer to sit down and develop a system. Similarly, when you're creating simulations, it is just a simulation of what would happen on different clicks, whereas when you're creating executable, then you're implementing some things. So but obviously the more time and cost you spend here, you are going to recover later on. So it can be said, not with certainty, but we can always say that if we make an executable prototype, then it will save more rework. It will cause lesser rework towards the later part of the software development life cycle. So you can say you're going to spend more on executable when you're using executable prototyping approach, but you're going to recover it later on as well. And similarly, you can also relate that with the simulation approach and the paper prototyping approach. So I guess that is it from today's lecture, and we have discussed different elicitation techniques, and in the next lecture we are going to talk about few more techniques, and we'll continue our discussion with the requirements elicitation process. But before we end today's lecture, let's quickly recap what we have done today. So let's quickly summarize what we have done in today's lecture. So we continued our discussion with the elicitation process, and the first elicitation technique that we looked today was scenarios. And we said what is a scenario briefly. So just to recap, we said that scenario has 5 things. It has 5 things. Number 1, it would have the initial state of the system. That's the first thing that it has. Then it has some normal flow of events which would happen in that scenario. It would have some exceptions that might occur during the scenario, and if there are any concurrent activities or tasks in a scenario, then it should also have the representation of those. And then finally it would have the end state, or you can call it the final state of the system when the scenario ends. So a scenario would have all these things, and we discussed an example of, for example, you want to order a new document from library, and what is the normal event, for example, in that case, that you supply your username and password, you give it to this event, and and then based on it you can basically look up for that document. So you are looking up for that document, and then you order that document. And so this is kind of the normal flow. And then there can be exceptions. For example, when you're logging in, then an exception can be that your invalid username and password. And similarly, when you're looking up for a document, then it might be that you do not have permissions and stuff. So we said that a scenario would have all these things. A scenario is the way a user kind of interact with the system, or what happens. So you have an initial state, and then an event occurs. What happens next? So we said that as very something which we are very familiar with, which is thought of as scenarios, is use case diagrams. Use case is one way of thinking about scenarios, and there are different views of of scenarios and use cases. Where people might say that a scenario is a use case, or multiple use cases are represented as a scenario. There can be different views, but we also discussed that if we think about our learning management system example, and there are different ways in which a student can interact. If we try to make a student you try to indicate all the use cases where a student is interacting with the system, then your student is logging in, student is viewing his courses, student is submitting assignments, student is viewing his grades, then all these use cases, they are possible scenarios. Okay, so each path in a use case diagram is normally considered a scenario. So for example, a student logs in and he logs out, that's one scenario. A student logs in, he views his grades and logs out, that's another scenario. So a scenario, why are scenarios interesting and useful? Because that's a very interesting way of recording what user is actually telling you, because normally it's if you're trying to document everything, if you're trying to write everything, then you might skip on lots of very things which somebody is actually explaining you very quickly. So making these scenarios and making these use case diagrams is a very effective way of requirement elicitation. Then we also talked about requirements reuse, and as we said that if you have if you reuse requirements, if you have built a similar system, and if you have built a system or a similar application domain, then you can reuse requirements. Similarly, if an organization has some policies, it has some security policies, or it has some standard requirements, then they might supply you that. So those kind of requirements can be reused, and if we are reusing requirements, then it saves us cost and time. Moreover, if we are reusing requirements and we have already done or completed a project on it, then we know that these set of requirements are already validated and they work. So it would basically save your time and lots of effort. But as we said that normally this is very informal. Organizations, they do try to reuse requirements, but there is no systematic way of reusing software requirements. Then another technique that we discussed is observation and social analysis, and we said that ethnography, or an ethnographer, what he does is he basically goes and sits with people and he tries to observe and he tries to model the current practices of the people working in a work environment. And we said there are different viewpoints from which an ethnographer actually views people work. For example, there is this physically you want to see how people are interacting with different objects. Then you want to understand that how in complete organization, how different people are dealing with a particular process. And you also want to see that how different processes interact with each other. What is the input from one activity to another activity? So there are different ways of understanding why how different how an ethnographer would actually try to observe people. And an interesting thing that we said, that it's a good idea to combine ethnography with other elicitation techniques. For example, you can combine interviews with observation, you can combine prototyping with observation. But what normally happens is that whenever an ethnographer is observing people, he basically takes lots of notes. And based on these notes, he would try to analyze, he would do an ethnographic analysis or observation analysis, where he will try to model that this is my interpretation of how this person deals with the system. And then what you try to do is then you try to share that, you try to debrief that with the people, share with the people who are not part of that process. And they might be able to give their perspective on it. They might say, okay, no, this doesn't make sense, go back and do it again. Then you basically do a focused ethnographic session again, and you try to observe one particular guy, and then you make, if you want to combine this with prototype, then what would happen is that you have done your ethnographic analysis. So I've done my ethnographic analysis, I do my debriefing meeting, I've done that debriefing session as well. Based on it, I would make a prototype. But when I do that, I might find there are some problems. So I would do a focused ethnographic session, and I go back here, I do prototype again, and these kind of things. So you can always combine prototyping with this observation and social analysis with other elicitation techniques to increase the effectiveness of the elicitation process overall. Then towards the end of the lecture, the final technique that we discussed is prototyping. And we are very familiar with prototyping because we have talked about this prototyping model in your initial courses on software engineering. And we discussed there are different types of prototyping. Normally there is a throwaway prototype, and then there is the evolutionary prototype, and both of them, they serve different purposes. Normally throwaway prototypes are to understand and to elicit requirements, and this throwaway prototype is only done for those requirements for which you do not have clear understanding. Whereas evolutionary prototyping is done to deliver something executable to the client, and the prototype would be made for only those requirements which you completely understand. And normally this is done when you're doing or following agile methodologies. And then we also discussed there are different approaches of prototyping. You can make a prototype on paper, you can simulate a prototype, and you can use a fourth generation language to make an executable prototype. And each one of them, depending on your approach, you might end up spending more time and resources or more cost, and that is one of the flaws with prototyping, that people believe that we are wasting our developers' time because they had to make a prototype, and our execution schedule might be longer because we had to make a prototype. But these costs, they are normally recovered. That's the beauty of prototyping, that if you develop that clear understanding of the product, then the rework that would have occurred in other case, it's not going to happen now, because you developed the system correctly now, and the changes that were to come if you would not have done this prototyping, they're not going to come now. So in the end, you save up time as well. So this is it from today's lecture. Inshallah, in the next lecture, we'll continue our discussion with few more elicitation techniques, and we'll try to finalize our discussion on the elicitation process and journal. So take care, and Allah Hafiz.